I used this quote when I was on stage in the panel discussion, and I would say the same thing again when it comes to broadband access or accessibility in general for use of technology in education and the education sector. We definitely pivoted very quickly post-pandemic, middle of pandemic, to move to mapping a e-learning or technologically assisted learning for remote classrooms. A huge shift in a sector that traditionally does not move fast at all. And so what that laid bare was some amazing possibilities, because we were able to see what a rapid pivot could do for the education sector when it came to using digital technology and e-learning to create remote classrooms, increase accessibility. But it also laid bare the inequities that already existed and exacerbated those. So, for example, in those places that don't have broadband access, although there was some reinvestment in an attempt to bring more users online, it hasn't fundamentally shifted those improvements in a way that promotes a model of equity. And in part that's because the pandemic only lasted a certain amount of time, education funding is limited, and remote communities, it would take a fundamental shift in how we think about digital infrastructure to increase broadband access. And I mentioned a quote in the panel, one of my favorite William Gibson quotes: "The future is already here, it just isn't evenly distributed yet." And that's how I think about both broadband and accessibility in general when it comes to digital learning and e-technology for the education sector and for classrooms, for students. That our mindset needs to have moved with that pivoted shift to think about education reform in the same way we would think about a enterprise total reinvention for putting digital technology at the core of our education system that would underpin the funding necessary for it. And in the same way that we're committed to providing accessible public education as a human right, as a fundamental right, that part and parcel of that now needs to be a mindset that has a foundation and a core of digital technology as one of those principles. And that would mean a shift in how we think about funding the entire education sector, and also how we're evaluating measures for student success. That framework has really shifted, but I don't think the legislative, the funding, the policy components of that shift have caught up yet in order to ensure excellent supportive broadband tech and excellent teacher professional learning to support e-classrooms and digital tech across the province in the same way that we might see it in many of our more readily connected urban centers. It's a long, complicated answer to a fairly straightforward question, but it's a long, complicated answer to a fairly straightforward question because there is no one-size-fits-all. Every community is different. Every demographic of students in each school board have different needs in terms of levels of support if we look across the province. And even a fundamental shift in how we think about broadband accessibility and funding won't necessarily address those. We can't miss the pieces that were there before the pandemic and a shift to remote learning and an investment in digital learning for our students as moving away from what was already facing us as major problems in the education sector before the pandemic. We can't lose those pieces because that inequity that existed prior to is still there, magnified in some ways. Where now the ability of school boards to, even when we look at the learning management systems and the technology that's used province-wide to do digital learning, allows us to think about professional learning to our teachers and our staff in a fundamentally different way than we didn't have 2.5 years ago. We were able to roll out professional learning standards that can be consistent across the whole province with a suite of competency and education modules for those same staff people. But if that isn't programmed for and there isn't time made available to take it, and the compliance components aren't in place, then it doesn't matter how well connected we are. We still fall down on the fundamentals. Yes, there are. And I don't want to take away from school boards, and there were some today that were speaking that have some fundamentally amazing best practices. And we've seen a bit more investment from the government, particularly in terms of the curriculum changes that ensure credit accumulation for digital learning in high school. But what I see, because my focus is on equity, is where we fall down, right? So the successes in my mind are these islands of success, and they're wonderful. But I want to see a fertile land of success, not just peaks. I want to see, that best practice shared and funded and educated for with our pre-service teacher training, within the leadership capacity plans for our school boards, reflected in multi-year strategic plans for school boards in terms of replicating ways to measure that success and how they implement it, and more importantly, how it's funded by the province as well. So yes, there are best practices, but those best practices magnify where we have gaps, barriers, and that's where my focus tends to be. This really excites me. And I've been doing this kind of work for 25 years. So I think we're at a moment. I know we're at a moment, fundamentally, not just as an education system, but there's an existential moment for us as humanity. And the potentials for AI-enhanced digital learning and a shift in how we're thinking about education and education success is phenomenal. If surveillance capitalism and digital security and privacy and data mining and attention capturing weren't major concerns, if we could somehow hermetically seal those over here or solve those problems, I imagine a world where AI assists a classroom teacher and an education system, because all of a sudden, all of the use of digital tech that students are now growing up with becomes part of a user profile, much like a student record. That it's a digital profile that exists when you become a student at a school board. And that literally, you could have a portfolio evaluated for all of your online activity. Not that we would monitor it, but whenever you hit curricular expectations because of your online activity, that kind of technology, AI-assisted technology, through your profile could enhance, engage. You would be able to communicate to teaching staff how much time you had your eyes on task. It would be able to communicate where you're most engaged at when it came to anything you were interfacing with through tech. It would be able to further pull you in directions that would build on curricular expectations without you maybe even knowing about it, because it's something that you already love doing. And in the best case of scenarios, it enhances things like innovation and creativity and breathes new life into how we think about student learning. And of course, part and parcel with that means an emphasis in all areas of curriculum from K to 12 on critical thinking, empathy, and humanity. Because those are components that AI can't teach us, but vastly educate us about how to use AI in a way that makes us more successful. But we don't have those pieces right now, right? So all of the stuff I said, if we could hermetically seal that away, those are big concerns for us. And I think it comes down to fundamentals about how we think about education in general. In this existential moment where we're going through a climate crisis, where there is just been in the last 2 months a spike in hate all across school campuses, not just in Ontario, Canada, North America, and so on, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia spiking like never before. And the recognition that what some of the technology that influence us on a daily basis, students in particular, social media and so on, really has a way to misinform or provide disinformation that creates more isolation, more bias, more dehumanization, if you will. And when we think about tech at its worst, in terms of how it thinks about us as consumers and products to be mined for our data and our attention, that is a dehumanization. And that loss leads me anyway, to ask the question, how do we build into the fundamentals of an education system that needs to meet the needs of an existential crisis, not just in climate, but in housing, in opioid, in mental health, in economic disparity, in every area that we're thinking about, in a system that was built on 19th century thinking in a factory model, that was predicated about building skills for the next generation of workers, and now we're teaching students content from last century for jobs that don't exist yet. The questions that I wake up with and go to sleep with, and I don't have the answers to, but as educators, I think we need to grapple with. What is the goal of quality public education, and how do we measure its success? If its success is standardized test scores based on content taught in classrooms, whether it's through e-technology or not, that's the same in my mind as thinking about it as GDP. We're measuring an outcome in a extraction growth economy as some kind of ends to a means. And we know about GDP when we think about Amazon the rainforest and Amazon the company. One has extreme value in our economy, and it's not the rainforest, right? So that is, in that numbers game, something is lost, something of our humanity is lost. And so I think it is that re-explanation of our critical thinking, our ability to communicate with one another, and how technology can enhance that, and how AI can assist in making those connections. If we build empathy and compassion, trust, creativity as the fundamental cores of what students really need to build and succeed in, I think that is where we will really revolutionize how AI can enhance our ability as human beings to be the kind of world that's facing unbelievable, unprecedented challenges. And in this moment, because we pivoted so quickly during COVID, we recognize that as a fundamental crisis. These are also fundamental crises. And I think that there is that possibility that we can do that. It takes a huge shift in thinking. Yeah, I agree that fundamentally AI is not going to replace humans. At least the iterations that we're seeing now aren't going to replace humans. But when we are positioned in a world that thinks the measure of success is helping Bond villains build colonies on Mars. I mean, essentially, when we look at our success leaders, there are these multi-billionaire tech entrepreneurs who are looking at humanity in a very different way, to escape the current planet that we're a part of, or to have their consciousness uploaded into the singularity. They're thinking of AI in a very different way than I'm thinking of AI. And so I'm conscious that although I can see the best potential, though people who have a lot of power in our world are seeing a potential that doesn't necessarily meet the best that humanity has to offer. And I don't think of it so much as a tool anymore. A tool is something that you can use to help you. I think of it as an enhancement that we need. And I say need because we have to think about this as something that is going to reflect the best of us, and we need the best of us right now, or the worst of us if we're not careful. And that's different than a tool. A tool is always going to perform the same way. This has the potential to really embody that enhancement of the best pieces of us as human beings, and to save us from ourselves. Not that tech will save us, but that enhanced thinking that AI can help provide, that large language learning model, that generative AI can help us build on the histories and stories of others in the best possible way, has unmatched potential. And the dark side of that is also true. What I enjoy most about events like today is meeting other people and hearing opinions that are different from mine. So part of the work I do, that I love doing, not just as an educator, but as someone who's engaged in inclusive learning and thinking, is to recognize and to reflect on myself when I hear different points of view, diverse points of view, maybe even points of view I disagree with. That helps my neuroplasticity. It pushes my brain into saying, why do I justify the way I'm thinking? Or maybe there's something to this. It engages me in the most fundamental human level, those connections we make. Something that AI can never replace, that human connection that we make with one another. At an event like this, very different from all of the different online seminars that I participate in throughout the year. Being able to sit in the same space with somebody and look into their eyes. If I don't say a word to them and I stare at them for more than a minute, our oxytocin levels increase. Our fundamental circadian rhythms begin to coordinate, and all of a sudden I begin to trust you more. That's amazing! Right? That's something that no screen can provide for me. And so listening and being in the same space and sharing with one another to build on that, the best parts of our human story together, is why events like today are so fun.